We felt no moral scruples about the possible future use of our brainchild. We were interested simply in exploring outer space. It was simply a question with us of how the golden cow could be milked most successfully. Those are the words of Wernher von Braun, the Nazi rocket scientist, as he left the ruins of the Third Reich for America, where he would become the father of the American space program. This is the History Book Buffs with Antonia Senior and Roger Moorhouse. And in this episode, we're going to be looking at Operation Paperclip, the incredible true story of how the American intelligence community brought thousands of Nazi scientists to the States, whitewashed their records, and set them to work. So, Roger, in this fascinating and exciting episode of the History Book Buffs, we're going to be looking at Operation Paperclip. So, first of all, Beef Pacey, what is Operation Paperclip? You fill us in, Roger.
Well, I mean, this is much more your bailiwick than mine, to be honest. But Operation Paperclip is the Allies grabbing hold of Nazi scientists at the war and subsequently after the war, hunting them down in many cases, and taking them off to America and utilizing all of their expertise and their knowledge in the sort of nascent phases of the Cold War, and of course subsequently. So the most famous, the poster boy for Operation Paperclip would be Wernher von Braun, from the German rocket program, who of course is one of the minds behind the later NASA space program. So there's kind of a straight line to be drawn between the V2s and the Apollo program.
The V2 rockets landing on London and
yes, exactly.
at the end of the war.
Yeah.
Brilliant. So we're doing Operation Paperclip. We should explain because there is a reissued book about it. This book originally came out in 2014. It's called Operation Paperclip by Annie Jacobsen. And I think she's just written a very well-received book which theorizes what nuclear war would look like. So they've reissued...
Cheery subject.
Yeah, I know, right? She can really pick her topics.
Yeah.
So she's reissued, or her publishers have reissued Operation Paperclip, which to date is, I think, still the best and most comprehensive account of what it was and what happened, and we're going to get right into it.
And why is that? I mean, why? Obviously, it's the thing for now, but is there any more relevance, do you think, we can pull out of this?
Is there any more relevance, Roger? It's almost like we talked about this before. And you're gamely doing a good segue there. Well done. So we have talked about this a lot because we're finding it quite salient at the moment in the fact that it's almost impossible to leave the house without having a conversation with someone about AI and the technological takeover.
Or a conversation with Alexa, even.
Oh, yeah, who listens in and occasionally chips in. So, and one of the strands of that we talk about a lot and we're very interested in is, China versus the US and in the race for AI and what it means to have technology being developed by a totalitarian state versus a democratic state, which is also obviously capitalist in tooth and claw. So we think there are lessons and parallels, and it's, and we're on the sort of opening lap, I think, of a new technology race between two different ideologies fronting up to each other.
Yeah. And at the moment, we're kind of seeing it purely as technological, but the political element behind that is going to become more and more relevant.
Yeah. And the ideological differences between the two systems will become more and more salient,
more significant.
So this is one of the reasons why we've been talking about doing Operation Paperclip anyway. And then this book by Annie Jacobsen came out, and it is a fantastic book. Highly recommended. It's very broad in scope. It basically is entirely really focused on the American angle. So we're going to talk about the Soviet side as well, because that's of great interest. The Jacobsen book, which I strongly recommend, is mainly American. And we're going to talk about the development of Paperclip and what happened in the first place. But what we're also going to do, obviously, is circle back to the ethical question. You love an ethical dilemma.
I'm all about ethics, me.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's absolutely, the ethics of using that technology in many cases, which have been perfected and developed using slave labor, using concentration camp labor. And that was a question post-war that many people addressed, and the American administration wrestled with itself. But it's one that we'll come back to later on.
Yeah. And I think we need to circle around the question, is it ethically justified to allow these scientists that we're going to talk about in this program to have nice and comfortable lives in the United States in return for their scientific expertise? And that's quite an interesting and cheery question.
Yeah, indeed.
All right.
Indeed.
Well, let's get into it. So,
so come on, tell us about Operation Paperclip itself, right? So you've got, we were talking earlier on, you've broadly got 3 phases to Operation Paperclip. So talk us through the first one briefly.
Okay, so it's the closing months of the war, right? Hitler's basically defeated, but he's refusing to admit it. Albert Speer, who's in charge of a lot of the weaponry programs, is sending him an email going, an email? Adolf@bunker.com is sending him messages saying, look, it's over. And Hitler's like, no, it isn't. We all know this.
I hope there's no one out there actually with the address adolf@bunker.com, because it'll be absolutely deluged with emails now.
To be fair, if you've got that email address, you go to have everything coming your way, don't you? I mean, my God.
Very true.
Yeah. Anyway, right. So the war is, everybody knows that the Germans are losing. So the Allies and I said the Allies and the Soviets, but of course at this stage they are technically our allies as well. We're all racing towards Berlin from different places. We're going through Europe, and in the course of going through Europe, we are coming across all these differently located areas where Nazi scientists or German scientists who've been co-opted, both enthusiastically and perhaps in some cases less so, into the Nazi regime, are conducting a whole range of innovative experiments and kind of creating things from rockets to radar to submarines to experiments on human anatomy, etc., etc. So the Allies know that this is the case, and behind each Allied army on the American side and the British side and the Soviet side, there's like almost a secondary army of thousands of intelligence officers and scientists who've been co-opted into the intelligence services and engineers who are looking for all this tech, right? They know it's there. The V2 bombs have flown into London. They know the rockets are there.
And Antwerp.
Yes, and Antwerp. And
let's not forget Antwerp.
Oh, who could forget Antwerp? And so they're looking for what they can find. And at the moment, it's a fishing expedition because they know some of it must be there. They want to know what's going on with the German biological warfare bits. They want to know, obviously, about the rocket programs. They don't yet know quite the extent of some of this, some of the more darker sides of the medical experiments that have been going on, which we're going to come on to talk about. So they're looking for these scientists. And I think it's important to stress, isn't it, that at this point, the Americans are still at war with the Japanese.
Yeah.
So what they're looking for at this point is any edge that they can get in their war with the Japanese.
Yes.
Right. So they're looking for military hardware. They're looking for military expertise, etc.
And the other angle, which I'm sure you'll come to, but the other angle of denying the technology to the Soviets, and they're already thinking that. And I had the same thing in my book Wolfpack. I came across that a great document where the Allies are sort of divvying up the captured U-boats, and this is in June, July, I think it was, of 45. So right in the summer of 45, and the British are saying very categorically, the latest models that we had, which were Type 21 submarines, don't give them to the Soviets. Keep them for us, because it's just denial of the latest technology to someone who an ally then, but still someone who is recognized as your rival, not yet your enemy, but certainly your rival.
Yeah, and
so there's that aspect as well.
100%. And as 44 sort of moves into 45, and that relationship between the Allies is very fractious already. And absolutely, they don't want the Soviets to get their hands on some of this stuff.
Yeah.
But equally, to be fair, it is actually quite haphazard and quite chaotic. There's different agencies. The Soviets are doing their thing, the British are doing their thing, the Americans are doing their thing. Even within the British and American the sort of communities who are chasing these armies down through Europe, there are different agencies at work. So there's like a special Pentagon unit that's charged with finding out about everything to do with aviation, rocketry technology. There's another one that the US Air Force is sending in to find out everything about aviation. But sometimes there's crossover. So it's not even that they are competing mainly against the Soviets at this stage, but they're also competing against each other.
And then there's other agencies and individuals who are starting war crimes investigations.
One of the guys who actually illustrates the point that we have just made was Dr. Hubertus Strughold.
Yes.
And he was the wartime director of the Aviation Medical Research Institute, right? So they're doing all sorts of experiments, and these experiments are pretty horrific.
Yes.
Now, there is debate that will become ongoing about how much Strughold, who was technically in charge of the entire thing, knew what his subordinates were up to in Dachau.
Somehow he claimed ignorance of what his subordinates were doing.
He's been hunted down by both one of the science intelligence officers who's trying to find him because they want access to what he knows about, aviation medicine. Like the Germans have done some really good stuff about how bodies can withstand high temperatures and pressure and low temperatures and whatever. So they're trying to find him. But at the same time, he's been hunted down by the War Crimes Intelligence Unit because of what's been going on at Dachau.
They had a couple of programs, one of which was they had a mobile pressure chamber, basically, into which they would put particularly Poles and Soviet prisoners of war, because they just considered these people to be expendable, and then reduce the pressure. So you're basically experimenting with what how the human body reacts to a drop in pressure. So you can see that the practical application of this, which the Nazis were just beginning to look at, was if you've got pressurized aircraft, which was coming technology at that point, what happens if it depressurizes? What are the limits that the human body can handle? They chose 200 of these prisoners for these experiments. 80 of them died during the experiment, which is pretty hideous. The remainder that survived the experiment were shot anyway by the SS. They were doing similar experiments in terms of exposure, like dropping body temperature. So if you imagined a downed pilot in the Atlantic, that your core temperature drops so far that you can't get it back. So they would drop the core temperature of these prisoners by putting them in ice baths, and then try various methods to try and raise the temperature again successfully to revive the patient. Again, with often catastrophic and hideous results. But this is the information, and not necessarily technology, but the sort of data that would later, be considered significant by the Americans, of course, going into the Cold War.
Yeah,
and this is why they're chasing after people like Strughold.
Annie Jacobson's book is sort of structured a bit at points like a sort of, narrative hunt. So there's people chasing these guys down. And when they're on the hunt for a lot of these doctors who are involved in the Dachau experiments, they start interrogating them. And initially, some of them say, oh, well, we never experimented on humans. No, we did like mice. And then a couple of them said, oh, well, we did do adult pigs. And then the investigators later discover that adult pigs is the code word for, human.
The
body.
Germans did love a euphemism.
Unbelievable. Listen, I want to ask you about this while we're here, right? Because we're going to talk about some other pretty horrific people, but the none so horrific as these doctors who are doing the medical experiments. At one point, there was a list created of German scientists who are doing useful stuff for the Reich, right?
Mm,
And this list becomes part of what the Allies use to hunt down these guys. It's found. It's there's quite a funny story about how it's found. Like somebody had tried to stuff it down a toilet and flush it in one of the Polish facilities that the Allies took over, but one of the lab technician pulled it out, and he was Pole, so he was like, "Okay, I'm handing everything to the Allies. I am not a
that's
member of the
good.
Reich." Yeah, so. Anyway, so there's a list. There's 15,000 German scientists on this list uh, who are recognized by the Reich as doing useful work. Now, one of the reasons why the Allies are so interested is because German science has got an outsized reputation from before the war,
Mm,
right? These are gifted, brilliant men, largely, who before the war were working collaboratively with their European and occasionally American colleagues. How do you go from being a sort of, professor of anatomy in a obscure German market town to someone who's doing experiments on?
I suppose we could say the collapse of morality. Well, collapse of morality would be one phrase. I think there's a different element here where the SS and the Nazi regime itself didn't see itself as amoral. It saw itself as having a different morality, where it put the well-being of the Aryan race, for example, above all else. So that shows you that it wasn't the sort of moral vacuum by their own judgment anyway. So that's how they viewed things. And as a sort of scientist, now you could have been politically on side. It wasn't that unusual, even among those in education, which we now know is fairly liberal profession. But in the 1930s, it was seen as very progressive, and progressive often meant the other way. I mean, this was seen as the future. This was the sort of the thrusting political avant-garde. For many, was fascism. It wasn't the left. The left was seen as sclerotic and rather disproven by events of the 1920s and 30s. So you could have been ideologically on side as a scientist. For those that weren't, it's about essentially ambition. It's about career. You've got the institutions of this new regime are potentially or offering to throw money at you for research projects that perhaps you wouldn't ordinarily have thought would be acceptable, but you'll think, well, okay, if this means I get promotions and I get sort of a cushy number, I'll do it. And I think it's as simple as that.
I wondered, and this point isn't made in the Jacobson book, and I would be very fascinated to see if this existed anywhere, but it possibly doesn't, because the scientists that we're talking about tend to be very quiet afterwards about their motivations and their activities during the war for obvious reasons. But like, whether it felt like an opportunity in some cases to do things that illuminated scientific mysteries in ways that conventional morality couldn't have
be
allowed.
done ethically under
and maybe
that
whether
too.
there was a sort of dark allure to that. Wernher von Braun.
Yeah, so he's a good example, right?
Yeah, he's in charge of the German rocketry program, we should say, right?
Yes.
Yeah, and he's obsessed with rockets. He wants to explore space.
Yeah. So he basically says, in one of these sort of post-war accounts, he says, well, basically, I would have gone along with anyone that was going to help me do that, because that was his fascination.
Yeah, but not only are they going to help him do that, are they going to help him build his rockets, he also gets access to tens of thousands of slaves to build the rockets. So the conditions by which these men were put to work building the V2 rockets were
horrific,
unfathomably awful. But they create but I just feel awful even using the word
be a but after that. Yeah.
But from von Braun's perspective, it was one of the reasons why he could create the things that he could do, because the labor force was so expendable, right? I mean, it's just horrific. But
and that's where I suppose that sort of malleable sense of morality comes in.
Yeah.
They're giving him what he wants, so he will. If he had moral scruples, he was willing to shelve them.
Well, it's extraordinary. So, Wernher von Braun, he's one. The other category that they're all looking for are the German scientists who are working on the biological warfare program. So the Germans have invented a new bioweapon called, I get the name wrong.
Tarbun and sarin. They both discovered them pre-war, actually.
Yeah.
And they're nerve agents. They're the first nerve agents.
Yeah. And the reason they're so terrifying is that the British have issued everybody with gas masks. But Tarbun particularly, I'm not sure about sarin, if the Tarbun lands on your skin, it will kill you.
Yeah, they are liquid, so it's by contact as far as I know. Yeah,
which means that all those gas masks are pointless. There's a guy in Annie Jacobson's book called Otto Ambros, and he is a chemist, and he works for IG Farben, which is one of these
big conglomerate.
Yeah, one of these companies that does not bear too much scrutiny for its relationship with the right. And he discovered sarin gas and also a kind of synthetic rubber. But he was also manager of IG Farben's slave labor factory at Auschwitz and managed a poison gas facility. So this was, and I want to emphasize that Jacobson does a brilliant job because we're just picking out a couple of these guys. She has chapter and verse on these people.
Yeah. And interesting, all three of those that we've mentioned, and there are many more. I think in total it was about 1,500 scientists that go to the US alone, isn't it?
Yeah.
But of these three, so Wernher von Braun, Hubertus Strughold, and Otto Ambros all end up in American service.
So until May 45, it's all quite haphazard. But just to your point about Tarbun, like the Soviets are all over this as well, right? So there's one bit, for example, where the Allies find a Tarbun manufacturing factory and just ransack it, and the Soviets get there slightly after them, and they dismantle this factory like rivet by rivet, take it back to the Soviet Union and rebuild it.
Well, the main factory was a place called Durenfurt, which is on the River Oder, so not far from what used to be Breslau.
Yeah.
And that fell wholesale into Soviet hands.
Yeah.
So there might have been other examples of other sites, but that was the main production site for German nerve agents.
Right.
And it was literally dismantled and taken east.
Yeah,
so they basically inherited pretty much the entire German nerve agent program.
Right. So we have to, this is the context, okay? So we have to bear this in mind. That everything that the British and the Americans are doing, a bit less the British, God love them, they're completely exhausted by this point. But everything that the Americans are doing, the Soviets are doing too, right?
Yeah.
So
and of course Peenemünde was liberated by the Soviets as well. So that's the V weapons base up on the island of Rügen up at the Baltic. So that is taken by the Soviets. So they inherit that as well.
Yeah.
So most of those, in terms of the infrastructure and a lot of the scientists as well, are just sort of inherited straight away as part of that Soviet conquest.
That's true. Although, so the British and the Americans get their hands on lots of the rocket technology. What I think happens is that there's a fair amount of documentation and there's a fair amount of hardware that both sides end up with. The question is then who gets the men who can interpret that documentation and who can explain the hardware, because this is complicated stuff, right? So it's not enough, they believe, just to have the stuff that they capture. They need the expertise of the men who built it.
Yeah.
But okay, Roger Moorhouse.
And there's the denial of the opponent as well. So there's
but so you're a Nazi rocket scientist in 1945, right? They're rampaging towards you. Your head is full of the stars and your rockets and your own self-preservation. Whose hands do you want to fall into?
Absolutely the Americans, without question. Not least because of the way the regime in those final months of its existence, the Nazi regime, had been fulminating against, the sort of the inhuman barbarism of Soviet,
which was
civilization.
Well, okay, but the inhuman barbarism of the Red Army was a thing.
Oh, it was a thing, absolutely, and but they had been fulminating against it, as this is the future and it's going to be like Armageddon, and the whole narrative, and you look at any German soldiers, for example, that had the choice would go west because they knew that it might be tough, but you get a better option with the Americans and the British than you will ever get from the Soviets. So it'll be the same for the rocket scientists as well.
Well,
and
I
everyone
mean,
else.
I read one memoir of a Soviet aviation expert who was one of the guys sent behind the Red Army to try and find German scientists. And he was humiliated and heartbroken by the behavior of the Red Army as they reached Berlin. He couldn't believe it. You know, there's one horrible bit where he tries to stop some Red Army soldiers raping some women, and then he goes to report them, and he's just laughed at. Anyway, so Wernher von Braun and his closest friends in the Nazi rocket program all voluntarily surrender themselves to the Americans, and there's the Jacobson book's really good on how they're kind of attempting to bargain their way into getting the Americans to treat them nicely by kind of hiding the documents, and like it's all like a kind of cat and mouse game. It's all beautifully done by her. But the upshot is that they're the first scientists to go to the States. So it's the rocket scientists are taken first in a kind of slightly haphazard thing before Operation Paperclip has even really formally got off the ground. And then sort of all the other bits start kind of lobbying. The aviation guys, the US Air Force wants some people over. The people making radar in America want the radar guys. Like there's a real kind of groundswell of desire to get these people back into the States.
So when does it become more formalized? When do you actually have Operation Paperclip as a formal process?
So I guess you can date it properly from May 1945. It's not initially called Paperclip, it's called Overcast. But in May 1945, Truman gives the green light to something called the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, which is like a subcommittee of the Joint Intelligence Committee, which has the similar role as ours. It's the kind of agency charged with condensing all the intelligence and giving it to the president. So it's a very senior body, and its job is to basically find the scientists, scrutinize their records
to some extent.
Occasionally, it turns out, suppress their records, whitewash little bits of their records, like Wernher von Braun. At no point was it made obvious to anybody until decades later that he was in the SS and utterly implicated in the slave labor economy of the German Reich. So they basically sort of massage this stuff. And then by the time, so there is internal wrangling. Again, it's all quite dense, but there is internal wrangling about the ethics of all of this. And then after the defeat of Japan, it really doesn't take very long for the perceived threat from the Soviets to be all pervasive.
So that becomes the overriding rationale. Is then the incipient Cold War.
Yeah. So in 1947, for example, the Joint Intelligence Committee prepares a report for the president, basically saying that we think we need to be prepared for total war with the Soviets, by which they mean nuclear, biological, and like on all fronts with the Soviets, and they think it will happen in 1952. And they know that the Soviets don't have nuclear at that point. They think that the Soviets won't get it until the early 50s because they don't know how much intelligence
they get it in 49,
they get it in 49. But they know that the Soviets have had access to a lot of the really good scientists, although not as many as they would like. So Stalin was completely furious that the Allies had got that the Americans had got all the rocket scientists. He was like, "We took Peenemund and we did this and we did that, and they got all the rocket scientists. There's no justice in the world." Anyway, the Americans formalize the process and they start bringing back lots of scientists, and it happens. This is kind of phase 2, so it happens over the next sort of into the early Cold War, into the early 50s. There's about 1,500, 1,600 I've seen scientists and their families are brought across to the States. And, some of them, initially, maybe some of them are in kind of like really nice kind of holding camps that aren't really camps, but like kind of beautiful houses in the middle of nowhere or whatever. But by and large, they then become kind of integrated, as any American.
And I mean, with positions and honors and being paid and,
oh yeah,
integrated into society and all of that. So
yeah, with these
what's not to like from their perspective?
incredibly dark pasts.
Yeah. In contrast, what's going on with, I mean, the Soviets are doing the same thing. So we had about 1,500, 1,600 scientists go to the US. 2,500 end up in the USSR. What are the circumstances of how they end up and how they are treated?
Okay, well, it's astonishingly not quite the same.
Is
so
it?
no,
Yeah.
so it's October 1946. Up until that point, the German scientists had largely stayed in Germany, but they were all in the Soviet zone, right? And they were working on various projects. And then Stalin begins to think, actually, some of this stuff they're working on is too sensitive to be out with my control, right? These guys need. So he sends Ivan Serov, who is one of the baddest
senior
bad men.
NKVD man.
Yeah, senior NKVD man, and was he was responsible for the harrowing of Poland. I mean, he is
and the Baltic states.
Yeah.
He was responsible for the Serov instructions of 1941 about who was to be considered a suspicious individual by the NKVD, which is a huge proportion of the population.
You do not want Serov
You don't
considering you
at
a
all.
suspicious
No.
individual. This is very true. Anyway, so Serov gathers the Soviets who are working with the Germans in the German occupation zone, because loads of Soviet scientists have come to learn from the Germans in the German occupation zone. So he summons them to a meeting, closed doors. They're all bricking themselves because half of them have been in the Gulag. A load of the Soviet scientists had fallen foul of the purges, had spent the last parts of the 1930s, the early parts of the war in the Gulag, slave science camps, right?
Wow.
If they were lucky. I mean, the unlucky ones were in Kolyma or whatever.
Yeah. And under the ground.
Yeah. So these guys knew to be terrified of Serov, right? Anyway, he calls them to a meeting. He says, we're going to take all the Germans, all your colleagues you've been working with for 2 years, and their families. We're going to forcibly deport them to the Soviet Union in 2 days' time. And the Soviet scientists are like, okay. And then Serov orders them to throw a dinner for their German counterparts. And then he says to all these Soviet scientists, you can't drink, right, at this dinner. You've got to pretend when you're drinking vodka, it's got to be water. What I want you to do is just get all these German scientists toasting the success of this joint program, like get them all really, really drunk. So when we turn up at 2 a.m, they're all completely pissed and befuddled.
Wow.
And so this is all in the memoirs, the brilliant memoirs of one of the Soviet engineers, rocket engineers, a guy called Boris Chertok. And, he, to be fair to him, he does feel a bit, he feels a bit bad.
Is he a bit conflicted by that?
Yeah, he mainly feels a bit bad because he has to spend the whole evening sober, and he doesn't really like it. Anyway,
wow.
So the upshot is, overnight in October 1946, they're used to these kind of operations, so it's no big deal for them.
Yeah.
They moved 2,500 German scientists and their families are forcibly removed to the Soviet Union, to these camps where they have to, do science for Stalin.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And the conditions, pretty grim.
Pretty grim. I mean, sometimes not too bad, like certainly compared to kind of, so the guy who goes on to become the chief of the Soviet rocket program is a guy called Sergei Korolev. He was in the purges. He was actually sent to Kolyma. So he's in charge of the Soviet rocket program. He's got no teeth because he lost them all when they were knocked out by the guards. He's got a heart condition. He can't turn his neck because he got so badly injured. He had scurvy in the camps. Because Kolyma was you know, the Gulag is
one
bad.
of the worst.
Kalima is like
Absolutely, is a level on.
on bad,
Yeah.
right? So it's a miracle he was alive, but he was very, very physically damaged by it.
Well, the worst Gulag camps had higher death rate per annum than German concentration camps.
Yeah.
Which is not widely known, but it's absolutely correct.
Which is what Korolev survived to
Yeah.
go on to then kidnap all the Soviet.
Yeah.
I mean, he didn't personally do the kidnapping, but he
Astonishing.
he actually didn't rate the German scientists that highly, and he only used them for a few years. And then the Soviet space program, the rocket program, kind of went in its own way. So they were less integral. Meanwhile, over in the States, Wernher von Braun and his pals become utterly integral to the American rocket
indispensable,
program. Indispensable.
Could we say? Yeah.
To the American rocket program, which then it initially starts as a kind of way of delivering, you know, weaponry, but morphs over time into the space program. And he is absolutely Mr. Space.
But that was always his thing. I mean, his fascination, even as a child, was space. It wasn't necessarily rocketry. It wasn't the military application of rockets. It was just space. That was his thing. So in a sense, he had come, for all the moral questions around Wernher von Braun, he'd come sort of full circle. That was what he foresaw right at the beginning of his fascination with space.
So was Korolev. I mean, and both of them, the similarity between them is that both of them were kind of used the lever that was the application of rockets for military purposes and then spying purposes to get money from the regimes to further the
to
interests
enable
of
them
their
to
main,
do the stuff they really
the
wanted
stuff
to
they
do.
wanted to do, which was space exploration.
Yeah.
And it's quite an interesting, chewy thing, isn't it? Because on the one hand, you've got, you know, Korolev working for the Soviet space program, who's a kind of broken man who's still doing his best for a country that's betrayed him. And then on the other hand, in America, you've got von Braun, who is a Nazi who built his career on slave labor, but
who's
working
sharp suits, nice, you know, nice house.
Yeah, but he's
picket
working
fence,
for, you know, if we want to be like reductive, he's working for the good guys.
Yeah.
And Korolev's working for the bad guys.
Yeah.
Which is, you know, kind of chewy. Anyway, we're getting sidetracked.
So the last phase, so we're sort of phasing into that last bit, which is, you know, that phase 3, if you like, of this period. So a lot of those that are kidnapped eventually get back to Germany.
Yeah. The German guys who kidnapped by the Soviets, we should say, they get back. So they're kind of they're all released from sort of 49 to 51 really, and they mostly go home. In America, a lot of these guys just goes from strength to strength.
Yeah.
So Strucold, who we talked about earlier, he was the aviation guy. He became known as the father of space medicine because he became the guy who was like working out how human bodies could withstand the pressure of going into space. And he was instrumental and feted. Otto Ambros, who we talked about, who was the guy who discovered sarin. He ended up working for the US Department of Energy and various US chemical conglomerates. I mean, these guys had embedded themselves into American society.
Yeah.
And then it's only later on, in sort of dribs and drabs, rather than in one great kind of, you know, bonfire of embarrassment, in dribs and drabs, this comes out, and some of them are embarrassed, and some of them are stripped of honours.
But very often only after their deaths. I mean, that's the same case with Strucold, wasn't it? That actually only after his death did all of this come out, and were his honours stripped from him. Yeah. So in many cases, they enjoyed a very comfortable existence as, you know, scientists and at the very peak of their powers in the US.
No, I think that's absolutely right.
What about, so let's come back, first of all, the utility of this.
Okay.
So there are two now, I don't know, can we talk about, I suppose, the sort of salient point of this, I suppose, is the rocket program, or both rocket programs, both Soviet and American. Are there, the assumption is always, and this is the assumption I've always had, that you can draw a straight line from V2s via Wernher von Braun, Operation Paperclip, to Saturn V
Mm.
and, and Apollo landing on the moon.
Yeah.
Is that fair comment?
It is it is the American program. There is a direct straight line, and that's all embodied in the person I think of Wernher von Braun, because he becomes so central to it.
Would it have happened, i.e. the moon landing, without Wernher von Braun?
Well, possibly, yeah, because look at the correlative case. In the Soviet Union, they got Wernher von Braun's second in command, a guy called Helmut Grotub.
Yeah.
And they did mine the German engineers and scientists that they got, for all that they were worth. But the expert historian on all of this is a guy called Asif Siddiqui, who has had access to as much of the Russian archives as one can get access to, and has written an amazingly brilliant, quite dense book called Challenge to Apollo. And in that, he argues very clearly that the Soviet rocketry program kind of
It sort of diverged
away from the German
stuff.
Yeah, and so from 47, 48, Korolev wasn't really paying much heed to his German counterparts, and that matters because right the way through the 50s, don't forget, the Soviets were winning the space war, right? Their technology was fantastic. The Americans later overtake them, right?
Yeah.
But it was the Soviets who were breaking
so Gagarin,
all the ground.
Laika, all of that stuff. They were ahead of the curve.
They were ahead of they were winning, right?
Yeah.
So, and which is not just so both sides benefited from a massive shortcut that was Russian.
Yeah.
That was German rocket technology.
Yeah. Yeah.
Would they have got there without it? Possibly. Some of the space medicine stuff that Strucol did. I mean, they probably would have got there without him. They just had him. I mean, these counterfactuals are kind of these counterfactuals are imbued with too much hindsight, I think, to be useful for the ethical question.
Yeah.
And the ethical question is: you are an American politician in 1946. What are you going to do? What are you going to do? Stalin is not thinking about the ethical questions of this, right? He doesn't give a monkeys about the ethics. What are you going to do?
Yeah. And as it goes back to that point we were saying, it's not necessarily 100% you, if you like, sort of inserting these people into your own ongoing scientific programs. As much as anything, it's denying those people falling into the hands of your opponent.
Yeah, but also, I mean, it was also that in a lot of cases, the German technology was really good. I mean, as their field agents are moving through Europe and discovering this stuff, sometimes they can't believe how good it is. It's really, really advanced. So, the ethical question is difficult. I would say before I read this book, which I heartily recommend, I was very sure that the ethics were quite straightforward. That, if the science held up, how it was obtained in a time of conflict and crisis in the early Cold War was secondary, and what mattered was the technology and the science itself. Having read the book, I became less sure, but I think partly because it is utterly sobering and horrifying reading all the accounts of quite how terrible these men were and quite what terrible things they did.
Yes.
And how much their lives subsequent to Paperclip were, untrammeled and untroubled
by everything
that they'd done.
Yeah.
And that's difficult to swallow.
Yes. And just by way of illustration, I often trot this one out. The V2 rocket program, for example.
Yeah.
The camp that they were doing the construction of V2s at, which was all underground, is a place called Dora, Nordhausen. Which, because of the conditions at the end of the war and all underground and all of that, I mean, so it's a horrific environment to be working in for those slave prisoners, concentration camp prisoners that were building those rockets. So much so that the death toll of those constructing V1 and V2 rockets was greater than the death toll of their deployment.
No.
Which is
really
astonishing, right?
That's extraordinary.
Yeah. So more people died building V2s and V1s than actually being bombed by them.
That is insane.
Which kind of puts it, you can say, V2's amazing technology. It is, it's a step change in, space, in rocketry and sort of space exploration, all of that stuff. It's the next level. It's the first man-made object to reach space is a V2, right? And yet the other side of the flip side of that sort of, glittering story of human achievement is facts like that more people were killed creating those bloody things than were actually killed by their deployment in war, which is astonishing. And the book, highly
It's
recommend
really good.
it.
Yeah. Have you got any other recommendations along the same lines, Roger Moorhouse?
Well, I went a little bit slightly left field. I went with a book called The Nazi Doctors, which is by Robert J. Lifton, which came out a few years ago now. I think it was even in the 80s, I think it was originally, but it's been reissued. And again, it looks at that question that you addressed earlier on. So these are these doctors that very often were implicated in carrying out really quite horrific experiments using concentration camp prisoners, for example. So we mentioned the depressurization, we mentioned the hypothermia experiments. There were other experiments carried out in Ravensbrück, which was a women's camp up to the north of Berlin, mainly Polish prisoners from memory that were subjected to things like essentially battlefield wounds. So they would shoot them in the leg, and then work out the best way to treat the wound, right? Which is insane when you think about it. And a lot of these women died. A lot of them were maimed by the experience. I mean, some of them, survived the war and got home again, but profoundly changed by that. Very often life-changing, physical injury as a result. And the Germans referred to them as guinea pigs, Kaninchen. So they're literally guinea pigs for, the treatment of battleground injury, basically. So, I mean, what the question that Lifton goes into in that book is to a large extent tells the story, of course, but the sort of the overarching and the moral question is, how can medical professionals do that? Which is really interesting.
Yeah.
If the world you're operating in lifts its moral framework or changes its moral framework, how much are you willing to adapt to that? How sure are you that your moral framework is the right one? So all of that, and that's not a question of intelligence necessarily, because these are all highly intelligent people. But as he says, lots and lots of those that were involved in this were willing to alter their moral framework and were willing to go along with it for personal ambition, because they're doing the work that they're told to do, perhaps for a lack of scruple. But it's a really interesting examination of where where I suppose morality meets ambition. What about you?
So actually, there's a correlative point actually with the one I'm about to recommend. So I mentioned it when we were talking. It's the memoir by the Soviet rocket engineer called Boris Chertok, and it's 4 volumes. And disclaimer: I have so far only read volume 1. I know, but each volume is like really big.
Wow!
But it's fantastic. Translated from the Russian only a few years ago, so it's quite new that we have this resource. And actually, what's really interesting about that as a relation, so he's there for all the important stuff. I mean, he's central. He's right involved with all the main characters in the Russian space program. But he starts it with kind of a similar point, right? But kind of backwards point. So he's writing it in a post-Soviet Russia, and he saw the worst of the Soviet system. And he is trying to sort of say, or he says quite clearly, You know, just because the system was bad, we were doing incredible things. We were doing amazing things. The people who were working on this were, yes, potentially serving a state that is now discredited, but please don't discredit what it was that we achieved, because we were brilliant and we did brilliant things. I just think it's so interesting. So he's very clear on the one hand that, like, he understands why everything's being denigrated, but he's also looking around at the post-Soviet Russia of kind of, you know, which doesn't necessarily prize intellectuals, doesn't necessarily prize science, doesn't necessarily prize, you know, ambitions in that direction. It's a society in which there's one god, and that's Mammon, right? And
so he lived that long. He lived into the 90s.
Yeah.
So just very briefly recap the book. Annie Jacobson.
Operation Paperclip.
Operation Paperclip on the US operation. So just so we don't confuse, because we talked about the Soviets as well. So this is on the US plan to sort of, you know, seduce those Nazi scientists.
And just, I should briefly say, we've been quite generous to the Americans on the ethical point. She is not.
She's not.
She is. She thinks damning. It's a moral abomination.
Yeah.
And I hear
it's
her.
hard. Absolutely, it's hard to disagree with that. Yeah. Very good.
On the subject of moral abominations, we should probably draw it to a close.
Okay. Thanks for that.
Yeah, I'm not saying you're a moral abomination.
Oh, I thought that's where you were going.
No, I can't even say abomination, so you're winning. Anyway, we're rambling. Until next time.
Until next time.